Welcome to the Quantum Biology Collective podcast, where we break down the practical strategies of this emerging science, starting with healthy light habits and going wherever the quantum superhighway takes us. This is your host, executive and life coach Meredith Oak, with a quick reminder that podcasts are conversations, not consultations, and definitely not medical advice. We're here for informational purposes only. To follow up with our amazing guests, please do check out the show notes, and to stay in the loop with the QBC podcast, join our email list, also linked in the show notes. Okay, I've got just a fun little update for you today. We have a new podcast website. It's at qbcpod.com. That's it, qbcpod.com. And it's a way to find all of the episodes more easily. If you haven't already downloaded the podcast guide, you can get that there. Highly recommend. And it also links to something new we're doing, which is an online community for this podcast and people interested in the topics that we cover. It's open to anybody who wants to have fun and engage in good faith on these issues. So go to qbcpod.com and let me know what you think. I want to give a special thanks to my friend Todd Giannatasio from Tresnick Media. That's TRESNIC.com. He helped me to build this. And to be honest, I would never have done it without him. It would have been too overwhelming, but he really laid it out and showed me how to do it in an easy way and made it easy for me to maintain and update. So I wanted to thank him. He's not a sponsor or anything. He just was a huge help. And I think this community is going to benefit a lot from what he was able to do for me. So if you need any help with anything related to your marketing and online stuff, go check out Todd. You can book one-on-one sessions with him, which is super helpful, right? You don't have to get locked into some big long program. You can just jump in and talk to him and be like, what do I do? It's what I did. All right. So today we are going to get into it with Dr. Leland Stillman. Dr. Leland Stillman is an integrative physician. He's been on the podcast before. We did a whole episode on sunlight, really worth listening to. And in this episode, we talk about the rise in autoimmune diseases and how everybody is struggling with what to do. The people who are afflicted with autoimmune diseases are obviously struggling, but so are the people who are taking care of them. And as these diseases are having younger and younger onsets, that's often parents. And then the physicians are struggling because these are really crazy, complex situations, health situations that are brand new, right? They haven't existed before. So I said to Leland, okay, what gives? What's going on? What do we do? And we had a really interesting conversation. There's no, super clear answer to this. We're all working our way through it. But Leland has some good insights on how to manage it. And he also had some good insights on how physicians and healthcare providers can structure their practice to support people long-term. This is something that's going to be more and more important as we realize that the insurance model or the model of the health model that our government supports, depending where we live, is not really equipped to help us with these things. And it's not something where it's okay, we do a 6-week program and then it's done. It really is. We really all, as we know, healing's nonlinear and we all need long-term support. So how does that work? How do we do it in a way that's sustainable for the provider, for the patient, for the caregivers of the patient? Anyway, these were all things we talked about. And as I said, we don't have all the answers, but we have some directional insight, I think. We bring up a lot of questions that are worth reflecting on. And perhaps you have experience or ideas about what you think in your experience as a practitioner or as a patient. And if so, I would really love to hear about them. So pop into the website and the community and let's start having a dialogue so that we can move forward and create the systems that we would like to see and build the future that we would like to live in. All right, enjoy. Dr. Leland Stillman, welcome back to the QVC podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be back.
Okay, I'm going to start this out by telling you a story, and then I would like to invite your feedback. So this story is like a little bit unique, but also a version of a story that I've heard multiple times from multiple, mostly mothers over the last few years. So I was at a conference, nothing related to health and wellness, happened to sit next to a woman. I think she ran an accounting business. She heard that I was in wellness and she was like, oh, and she told me the following story. So her daughter was diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos disease. So they knew that. They were just kind of living with it. And then something happened where the daughter came down with really acute symptoms. I forget specifically. I think she maybe had broken out in rashes all over her body, but it was like to the point where they brought her to a local clinic, one of the really famous ones. They happen to live nearby. I won't say the name, but everyone knows it.
I'm assuming it's a brand name conventional medicine.
It's a brand name conventional medicine clinic.
Your grandparents would fly there for their care and make a big deal about it.
Exactly. The place where you think, if I need the absolute best doctors in the world, I'm going to go here. One of those places. So she brings her daughter in, and she said for like 3 days, her daughter was like the star of the hospital. Like every doctor in the place was crowding around her bed, asking questions, trying to figure out what was going on. She said by the end of the week, she couldn't get anyone to look her in the eye, and she couldn't get anyone to commit to even a follow-up appointment with her daughter. And when she asked, what is going on? They said, well, she has Ehlers-Danlos. She's like, yeah, I know. And an autoimmune disorder. And the mom was like, okay. And that was it. They were like, yeah, it's going to get worse. She'll probably be in a wheelchair in the next 10 years. Bye.
Yeah.
And that, when I met her, that was where she was at.
Yeah, I know. I know that story well.
So,
yeah.
What is happening?
Okay. So it's funny you tell me that story, because the way that story winds up being told to me on a call with a patient is we went to that clinic, and then maybe we went to another one. Then we went to our local out of the box thinker doctor. That person usually labels their practice as functional, integrative, natural, holistic medicine, sometimes environmental medicine as well. That doc may or may not have a solution for them. Usually that solution holds up for 3 to 6 months, sometimes longer. But remember, only the people who fail other doctors wind up seeing me. And we do tend to run a practice where the vast majority of patients are coming to us after they've seen a lot of other people, particularly the local people. And then I think it's 80 to 90% of our patients are out of state. So it's the vast majority of people who've already exhausted good local options for functional, integrative, natural, and holistic care. They've also often gone to everyone else, the dowsers, herbalists, channelers, energy healers, Reiki healers, traditional Chinese medicine doctors, chiropractors, everyone. And they've run out of solutions for them. And this is a gradual process of disillusionment, usually with one practitioner after another. And actually inherent in the disillusion is the model that the care is being delivered via, which is almost always fee for service. You step out of the conventional insurance model into the fee for service model. And there's a couple models there's a couple other models that we'll talk about. And then eventually people find us, and we have just a different mindset, different philosophy in the practice on how do we reverse disease rather than just accept it as an inevitability, with the fundamental underlying premise that the body can heal itself when you give it what it needs in order to do that. And that the body is a lot more like, frankly, every other piece of creation. Animals and plants, when they get sick, people ask questions like what's happening in the soil, what's happening in their diet, what's happening with their environment. You look, for example, at, whales getting beached on the sand all of a sudden because they lost their ability to navigate. We don't just say, oh, well, these whales have this weird disease and label it something. I mean, some people will, I'm sure, but there's logical explanations like, well, there was a Navy sonar operation off the coast and it disrupted their ability to navigate, and now they're beached on the sand, or they were poisoned by some kind of toxin, right? Tragically, and I think somewhat shockingly, conventional medicine doesn't look at people as things that can be gradually poisoned by their environment to the point that their underlying physiology falls apart. And the paradigm that's accepted in the conventional world is really very much a reductionistic, mechanistic model that doesn't work to create optimal wellness, which is why as soon as you start to talk to doctors who are interested in keeping patients well, they start speaking what is essentially a different language. And it's a language of what's going on with the patient in the real world. What are they eating? How are they living? Who are they having relationships with? What are those relationships like? What kind of supplements do they take? What kind of work do they do? What kind of toxic exposures have they had? What is their personal care product, their medicine cabinet look like? What does their pantry or their refrigerator look like? These are the kinds of questions that actually determine wellness. And in our practice, we really don't worry too much about what the diagnosis has been labeled, because the reality is that, like I said before, when you give the body what it needs to heal, a lot of illnesses just disappear. And so I hear that story all the time. And when we take care of patients, we just look in more places than the conventional doctors are looking, and we don't just rely on drugs and surgery. And we certainly don't assume that patients have a doom that they have to accept. And a great case of this is I mentioned to you before we got on the air, my collaborator at my practice, Amy Arp. Amy was going to go to medical school, ended up because of their vaccine requirements not being able to go, and decided she wanted to just go be a health coach because she wouldn't budge on that. And she had recovered largely because she'd recovered from multiple sclerosis before she went to medical school. And she has a very interesting story. We've released a first episode of her podcast story where it's a 2-part story. And in that story, she talks about what it was like being handed this diagnosis. And on the first day, having doctors say things to her like, you'll probably be in a wheelchair by your mid-30s. You'll probably never have children. And you certainly won't lead a normal life. And you should go home and get pregnant right now because this may be your last chance.
Wow.
Yeah. She struggled with, lots of significant symptoms of MS. This was not a mild case. They told her she was one of the worst cases they had ever seen in terms of how aggressive it was. She has a completely normal life. She is in her 3rd trimester. Amy and my wife are going to give birth, within weeks of each other this December. So
congratulations, by the way.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
I'm excited for the first Stillman baby.
We are too. So it's just shocking that, and Amy's story is amazing, compelling. I hope we should link to it in the notes. So she had a super aggressive MS diagnosis. Yes.
And she was able to reverse it
by completely, total remission,
looking
confirmed on
into
imaging.
Her environment.
Yes, she did all the things. And we're going to incorporate all of the things into the autoimmune recovery program that Amy and I are going to be launching together when she comes back from maternity leave in the late winter, early spring. And the goal is basically,
great. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, because, as I was saying to you, these moms, and not just moms, parents, people, right? These diagnoses are so ambiguous. They don't mean anything. And it's not even like cancer where the traditional system has an offer for you and you may or may not want to take it, but they have a course of treatment. I feel like we're now in a place where they've this woman whose story I said, they have nothing, they had nothing to offer her.
Yes.
So what I'm hearing you say is that the trajectory is for these types of autoimmune diseases, traditional medicine, they're like, we have nothing, come back when your symptoms are so bad, we can give you something to manage it.
Sometimes they have something, and oftentimes the treatment is worse than the disease.
Okay.
And in their defense, sometimes they have fantastic drugs that will make the disease and its symptoms go away.
Mm-hmm.
But
like what? Like what disease would that be?
Well, like for example, most of the immune modulators that they've come out with for allergy and autoimmune diseases work quite well to destroy or eliminate symptoms and signs of the disease. They do this though by essentially hamstringing different parts or elements of the immune response. When I was in training, I was actually quite surprised. There was the newest agent that had come out was a class of agents was the TNF alpha inhibitors. TNF alpha is tumor necrosis factor alpha. It's a cytokine that your body produces that basically runs around the body and helps your body to eliminate any kind of aberrant or defective cell. So it's very much implicated in autoimmune disease because if the immune system gets off track and starts, say, creating inflammation in joint capsules, cartilage, major organs, etc., being able to cut that response off at the knees with a TNF alpha inhibitor can completely resolve the patient's symptoms. I was shocked by the fact that this drug didn't lead to a massive increase in the rate of cancer. I caveat that by saying that they didn't detect it in their data, and to my knowledge, they still haven't detected a significant increase in cancer rates with this agent. But this brings us back to the problem with what we call pharmacovigilance. Pharmacovigilance is the practice of monitoring drugs for side effects. Mm-hmm. And you have to ask yourself, right? So you're giving 20-something-year-old women with rheumatoid arthritis a TNF alpha inhibitor, and they're at almost zero risk of cancer. Let's just accept that as a fact. And they are on that TNF alpha inhibitor for 40 years. You only find out if you increase the risk of cancer if you're bothering to look 40 years from when you started it, right?
Right.
Now, you ask the average patient what drugs they were on 20 years ago, let alone 40 years ago, and they say, I don't know, I was on something for my whatever. Sometimes they'll have completely forgotten the diagnosis. It's, I had this weird thing with my knees and hips. What does that mean? The reason I bring that up is that, the pharmaceutical industry is really gaming the system, and I would say this is quite intentional, by saying, okay, we studied this drug for 10 years. There was no increase in the risk of X, Y, and Z. Therefore, we can unleash it on the public with no black box warnings and complete confidence. And, as we've seen with one drug and drug class after another, oftentimes the system is just set up to not find the bad outcomes, right? And that's not just my opinion. In major medical journal editors, Marcia Angel, Richard Smith, many more have essentially said that the pharmaceutical industry sort of indirectly owns the major medical publishers and journals. And those journal articles and studies that are published therein are what is ultimately submitted to the FDA. And they control the process really soup to nuts. And there's really there's actually no consequences for them. When they make a mistake and they hurt a lot of people, they actually don't pay any penalties in excess of their profits. And it's something like a single digit percentage of their profits go towards settling the hundreds of lawsuits that they have to settle every couple of decades between state and federal authorities for essentially corporate malfeasance, whether it's civil or criminal litigation. But anyway, my point with that is just, if you look at the immunomodulator drug market, I actually looked this up the other day because we're preparing this as part of the autoimmune program. The market for autoimmune drugs is expected to grow from its current market cap of like 240 billion to 1.3 trillion.
God.
And to give people some context, the current pharmaceutical industry revenue per year is $1.3 trillion.
Wow.
The market for immunomodulating drugs is expected to eclipse the current revenue of the pharmaceutical industry, and that's in the next 10 years.
That's crazy. That is absolutely crazy. I mean, it makes sense, though, just anecdotally, when I think of the number of people who tell me that their child or their niece or their friend's child has one of these previously extremely rare autoimmune disorders. And now, like moms throw around terms like POTS and PANDA.
Yes.
Like everyone knows what those are. And
I know. And they weren't
they're so obscure.
Well, PANDAS was a thing when I was in medical school, but it was very rare. And
Yeah.
POTS was, I mean, I think POTS only crossed my radar when I was maybe in the middle of my training,
Right.
in residency. So that was 4 or 5 years after, medical school started. And, where this is all going is the emperor, I said this in my book, the emperor has no clothes. The conventional medical authorities really don't have a leg to stand on as far as how they're advocating for people to remain healthy and well. And we see this reflected in the absolutely horrific health statistics for doctors. Doctors don't outlive lawyers. That's embarrassing. Doctors have a risk of suicide. Female physicians have a risk of suicide. And this obviously depends on the data set you use, but this is the last data set that I recall reading from a major medical journal. The female physician suicide rate is 2.25 times that of the general public, and the male physician suicide rate is 1.5. This is a combination of being overworked by hospital systems that treat doctors horribly, being treated very, very badly by medical boards that are extremely predatory. Some of the stories of how they treat doctors are absolutely chilling. And I really mean that. I mean, just chilling. You wonder how human beings can treat other human beings that badly. It's coming from burnout, taking care of very, very sick patients where there's no hope. And I mean hope within the conventional medical model. And this is why doctors are fleeing that conventional medical model in droves. And I should mention as well that I think a lot of physician suicide is linked to the fact that doctors are leading lives that are just as unhealthy and dysfunctional as their patients. All the things you talk about on your podcast that are bad for the brain, bad for the body, they're leading to the epidemic of physician suicide because physicians are not being trained in a paradigm of how to keep people healthy and optimize their mental well-being. They're being trained in a model of, here's the drugs, here's the surgeries. When you run out of options, tell the patient that it's time for hospice. That's it, right? But what this is doing is, many physicians are bright enough to see that there's a better way, and they see people transforming their health with what has previously been called alternative medicine is probably better known to people as functional, integrative, natural, holistic, depending on which branding buzzword you want to use. And they're fleeing the system to start their own practices in the hopes of something better for them in terms of their quality of life, their happiness, their job satisfaction, better for them in terms of working hours, better for their patients in terms of the outcomes that they can expect and the kind of doctor-patient relationship that they can enjoy, and then ultimately better for society. I mean, in my book, the way that the conventional medical system is going, and I hate to say this, but society in general is very much a sinking ship. I mean, we cannot sustain the levels of disease. How does anyone think that we're going to be able to afford quadrupling or more than quadrupling, quintupling the cost of drugs for autoimmunity, not including surgeries, hospitalizations, outpatient clinical visits, rehab stays, inpatient rehab stays, and all the rest of the things that patients with autoimmune diseases need? No one in their right mind can expect our country, which already is, really struggling with healthcare costs, to afford 5x the amount that it's spending on one drug class. That's insane. So the ship is sinking. The people in charge are in denial. They're making a lot of money on the way the ship is running. And I don't think they want to face the music and say, this is not an acceptable course anymore, no matter how profitable it is. But so far, there's not much indication that they're going to, so to speak, come to Jesus about what's really going on. And so what we see in the practice is patients are waking up, patients are jumping ship, and they're looking for lifeboats. And that's essentially what small practices like mine are becoming. And it's really important for patients to understand that this is what I see happening is that the number of people looking for this kind of care is rapidly exceeding the capacity. And that's why I just told you before we went on the air that we've reached capacity in my practice. We have no capacity for further patients. We do have a waiting list. If you'd like to be added to the waiting list, go to stillmanmd.com and get a discovery call booked, and then add your name to the waiting list. You have to book a call and you have to keep the appointment to be added. There's no form. There's no portal where you just add your email. You have to have a warm conversation with us. And partly that's because we've actually had patients who were so unpleasant and unreasonable that we blacklisted them from the practice. Not many, but a couple.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
and that brings up an interesting point, which if you are going to jump ship into this
into a different paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
The patient have to be willing to do our part.
Yes.
We're not going to be handed a pill. It's like
Right.
if we do an environmental audit of our lives and there are some glaring issues, we have to be willing to fix them, or
Yeah.
we're not going to get the outcomes that we've jumped shipped to get.
It's a completely different paradigm. You have to take charge and ownership of your diet, your lifestyle, your daily routine, the thoughts you think, the words you speak. I've seen all of that make a difference in patients' care, let alone supplement protocols, medications, everything we're going to build into our autoimmune recovery program is what, Amy walked through herself because she's our coach for the program. And then what I've seen work for patients in my practice. And we decided to run this program because I looked back at all of my testimonials, and the people who had the best results were people who had an autoimmune disease or who they may not have been handed a label or a diagnosis of an autoimmune disease, but all of their disease processes were autoimmune in nature. And I essentially approached them that way, and they got great results.
Right.
So, yeah.
Even just in the name autoimmune, it would seem to suggest that if it can be changed, right? Like it's not a finalized thing. And autoimmune is most likely due even more than other issues to environmental factors.
Yes. Absolutely. There's no question about that.
I wanted also to quickly define some of these terms in case people don't know. So let's start. We mentioned PANDA and POTS. Let's start with those two, just sort of say what they are. And is there an environmental trigger that would lead, say, a 19-year-old girl who plays soccer and does really well in school, right? Like these are the kinds of kids that are coming down with these things. They're not necessarily like leading what we would think of as unhealthy lives. So you have a 19-year-old girl who plays soccer, does really well in school, and she's diagnosed with PANDAS or she's diagnosed with POTS or what are those two things and like why her?
So I do not have the definition of PANDAS memorized, but what I will tell you is the way that I think about all of these diagnoses. So basically the way I think about these diagnoses is there's dysfunction in an organ system. And we can judge that based on how the patient is presenting, their exam. It doesn't have to be on a lab test. It doesn't have to be on something like, say, an EMG or an EEG, which are quantifiable, repeatable tests that can examine things like electrical conductance and impulses being carried through nerves. And that's one of the things that I think when I explain functional medicine to people, I explain that we're focused on optimizing and improving function, because there's many patients who come to me whose labs are normal, and yet we're able to help optimize their function and improve their function with what we do. So who cares if their labs are normal? When I see dysfunction in an organ system, there's a pretty short list of things that causes dysfunction. They can be labeled as many different types of what I would call epiphenomena. But the simple fact of the matter is, if you've got dysfunction in an organ, there's some kind of toxic exposure, which may or may not include a stressor. So like, for example, a common stress that you would talk about on your podcast is EMF. How do EMF create disease? They destructure cellular water, which reduces the capacity of the cell to generate energy. And they increase oxidative stress, which is very well documented. And they affect the operation of calcium or voltage gated calcium channels, right? And that's just a few, top bullet points from the list of things that they do. But all of that degrades the ability of the cell to cope with stress. And so I consider it basically a toxic exposure. Now you can look at heavy metals, you can look at everything from aluminum to mercury to cadmium, you can look at pesticides, you can look at mold toxins. All of these things will interfere with normal optimal cellular and therefore organ function. So you've got toxic exposures as one big category. Then you've got chronic infections. Chronic infections can be incredibly difficult to quantify. And the reason why is that they can be incredibly small, right? There's so much controversy about that, and I don't particularly care to get into it. But at the end of the day, you will find in a certain amount of this disease tissue, there are microbes, pathogens, parasites, bacteria, viruses, whatever, that are present in excess of what the immune system can clear, can remove, can eliminate. And they will mimic your own cells in order to evade the immune system, which is a big piece of autoimmunity. We call that molecular mimicry. And then the third piece that I look for in cases is what I call metabolic imbalances. And metabolic imbalances is what most people would look at as nutritional deficiencies. But the reality is that you can have too much of a nutrient and then it becomes a poison. So you can't look at it as just a matter of nutritionally deficient states. You have to look at it as a matter of what is not in balance. Because someone who has an adequate level of zinc, but an extremely excessive level of copper will act like they're zinc deficient. And so even though the zinc level is normal, you give them zinc and they get better, right? So those are the three things that I look at. And if you go back in the literature, you'll see case study after case study, paper after paper where they talk about, well, we took biopsies from this autoimmune disease, or we did blood studies from these people with this disease, and we found that they had high circulating antibodies to this infection. So then we think this parasite or this virus or this bacteria is implicated in the pathogenesis of this disease. But you'll also see papers where they say, well, we found that the serum levels of this, that, or the other vitamin, mineral, nutrient metabolite are low, or the urinary levels are high, or everything in between, and so on. And what's that's implying is there's a nutritional piece of this as well. And you might look at these as like a three-legged stool, if you will. And then you'll also see papers where they say, well, we did looked at biopsies of this diseased tissue, either post-mortem or biopsy samples from patients who were diagnosed with an end organ disease and needed a biopsy. And we found that there were high levels of toxins. Microplastics are sort of the new kid on the block when it comes to toxins, but you can look at mold toxins, heavy metals, pesticides, petroleum-based toxins, you name it, and you'll find a basis in the literature for those toxins triggering pretty much any autoimmune disease you want. And if you don't have the evidence, just wait. In 10 or 20 years, some immunologist somewhere is going to generate that data. It's coming. So I don't view the roots of autoimmune disease as being at all confusing or obscure or esoteric. They're very clear, and we've been dealing with them for decades. Generations of clinicians outside of the mainstream have been sounding the alarm on this since well before I was born. And the reality is there's just a lot of stakeholders who stand to lose a tremendous amount of money, if not their whole fortunes, when the public really embraces a different paradigm, a different way of living. Because suddenly they're products that are viewed as medicines or nutrients, or at the very least harmless products or harmless ingredients will suddenly be viewed as they rightly ought to be, as poisons that should be avoided at all costs. But if the health of the general populace is any litmus test to judge by, that's happening. That's coming. People are more and more awake to this problem, and they're voting with their dollars. They're voting with their feet. The writing's on the wall. It's really a matter of who's going to maintain control of society, and will we maintain our freedom of speech to be able to say things like, this thing that you're being told is safe is actually toxic and doesn't work. Please avoid it for your health.
Right. Yeah, that's an open question of how open these conversations are going to be able to be, at least in a public setting.
Yes.
Which is why podcasts are so great. Nobody has time to listen to every single one. Hit the censor button. So I want to just talk about the lifestyle of a typical, teenager. Because I do find, you mentioned like a woman in her 20s getting rheumatoid arthritis, right? Like that's insane. Like I had a friend who was diagnosed with pulmonary hypertension when she was like 32. And the doctors were like, yeah, we don't usually see this in people under 80, right? Like it was, and then also all the other autoimmunes that we've mentioned. So, I'm thinking of a case of a young woman who was diagnosed with POTS, and she played sports. Probably a lot of it is at night with those giant floodlights on. And then after you play sports, you typically are probably up late doing your homework on your laptop.
You're forgetting the petroleum toxins in the fake dirt on the artificial turf.
You're playing on artificial turf.
There was some interesting reports not long ago about a unusually high prevalence of, I think it was leukemia or lymphoma in soccer goalies, who are the ones who are jumping into the dirt.
Face diving into it.
Isn't that interesting?
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Right. And not to mention the rash of injuries in professional American football players. My son got into it. He got into it this year and he's like, everyone's injured. So you have what to a typical parent is a very normal life. Your child is doing the normal things. And yet they end up with these obscure symptoms and this crazy diagnosis. So how do you direct these people? It's like, we got to unpack go through a week in the life of your child and let's unpack what they're exposed to.
You mean, how do we approach the case clinically?
Yeah. I guess I'm trying to help a parent understand, wrap their head around the idea that we might feel like we're living a normal, not unhealthy life.
I would get curious.
And yet these autoimmunes diagnoses are popping up in these children.
Oh, yes. I would get curious and I would start asking questions. And I would say, do you remember people like you or like your friends when you were growing up having these illnesses? And they would say no. Just like if you ask anyone over the age of 50, do you remember peanut allergy? They look at you like, no, it's like it just arrived one day. Bizarre. How did this happen? Why can't I make little Billy snickerdoodles? Everyone freaks out when I do. So you ask them, was this normal when you were growing up? And then when they say no, you say, do you think that, what do you think could explain this? And if they say genetics, you just say, well, then why isn't there a gene that we've discovered for this disease? And then when they say, well, I don't know, you say, so there's no gene. It's not genetic. And then you start to get them thinking, well, if it must be environmental, right? What is it in the environment? Because if it's not genetic, it has to be environmental. The environment being diet, lifestyle, environment, relationships, all of these things. And I always try to relate this to something that they are intimately familiar with. So, for example, I get a fair number of inquiries from lawyers. So if a lawyer is on a call with me, and we actually have a vetting process for the practice to make sure that before they jump into a program of care, they're a good fit so that we have a maximum chance of success, because we really have more people coming to the practice than we can serve. It's like 1,000 people apply every year and 10% of those come through as patients. And now it will be even less because we've closed the memberships, because we're at capacity, because people keep renewing. Our renewal rate is 80 to 100% from year to year. So if a lawyer were talking to me about this, I would say something like, if your legal firm were losing enormous amounts of money, what would you do? Because if you want to look at it as an analogy, somebody who's sick, they're losing their health, and a business, you're losing your revenue. And they would probably say something like, well, I would look here and I would look there. And I would say, would you expect there to be one reason for your firm to be losing money? And they would probably say no. And if they said yes, I would get really curious, because usually you can unpack the one reason they have, because they might say something pithy like, well, you don't have enough clients. Okay, well, why don't you have enough clients? Well, you didn't treat the ones you have well enough so that now they're not coming through. Or you didn't do enough advertising, or you didn't do enough this, or you didn't do enough that. And I use these analogies to help people realize that there is no one thing that's making them sick. There can be an 80 or a 90% block or a major trigger, but even triggers, I'll explain to them that, a trigger, just a trigger on a gun, like in a firing mechanism, when you pull a trigger, the firing pin comes back and then it moves forward and it strikes the bullet, and then the bullet leaves the gun, but you need a hand holding the gun or two hands holding a rifle or a carbine. And so it's not one finger pulling a trigger. It's multiple fingers connected to an arm, connecting to a person, connected to a set of eyes and a brain. And all of these things come together to create an outcome. So when people think reductionistically or simplistically about disease, they get really bad outcomes. And so when you start to talk to people in terms that they understand about complex phenomena in their life that they deal with every day, another common analogy or metaphor I'll use is cooking, because honestly, cooking is so, because it's chemistry, it's very similar to life in a lot of ways. And I'll say things to them like, would you put the icing on the cake before you put it in the oven? And they say, no, of course I wouldn't do that. That would be crazy. Right. And I say, so, the order in which you do things matter. The time you give things to happen matter. Right. And you use little analogies like this to wake people up. That's what I do anyway. And most of the time, frankly, we're not having conversations with people who don't already get these concepts, generally because we have a very strong referral from other practitioners and experts and influencers who are sending us their friends and family who already know the paradigm.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And I think, having an experience like I described at the top of interview, where your most trusted experts don't have anything to offer, that tends to lead people to be a little more open-minded to alternative ways of viewing the world.
Well, have you ever heard the story of how my mother got into all this?
No.
Oh, this is so funny. So my sister, her eyes crossed and she had a lot of sinus infections when she was a little child. I had a lot of ear infections and sore throats and illnesses. And my mother took my sister to the ear, nose, throat doctor to have a procedure done to relieve the congestion in her sinuses. And after the procedure, my sister is throwing up over an emesis basin in my mother's lap. And my mother looks up at the ENT. We were in New York. We lived in Manhattan at the time. And she looks at the ENT and she says, we've solved the problem, right? This will never happen again. And we never have to do this ever again. And the surgeon says, oh no, the holes we've drilled in her sinuses will heal up again. And we will have to go back in and operate another time in all likelihood. And at that moment, my mother said, this is unacceptably mediocre. I insist on something better for myself and my family. And she then proceeded to take us to every conceivable variety of, which is very similar to the story I told you that I hear from patients all the time. We went to dowsers and energy healers and channelers and Reiki healers and craniosacral therapists. And, I don't think I ever actually did acupuncture, but I did something that's even more uncomfortable called coining and cupping or moxibustion. And we went to chiropractors and we tried supplements and all kinds of things. And that was how I got fascinated by all of this and ended up where I am, with an open mind to all of it, because I was very, even though we went to the regular doctor for some things, for the most part, we tried to deal with everything naturally.
That's incredible. Good for your mom. And I think, and that's it too, right? It's like, we just accept these things. Like, I have a friend whose mother is going through cancer and they're doing, all of the traditional things. And even within that realm, my friend had to advocate like crazy to get her mother like the treatments that would most likely work for her, and to do the immunosuppressant therapies that, like she was finding the studies, she was harassing the doctors, and they were like, oh yeah, I mean, I guess, okay, I guess we could do that. And it's like, it's almost like the patient is not really part of the equation.
Patients need to realize that this is about the commoditization of healthcare. And patients need to take a good look in the mirror and ask themselves, how am I part of this problem? I take care of my patients like their family. And because of that, they're happy to pay a monthly membership fee so they have access to the practice. And the way we set it up was, I wouldn't want my family waiting 6 months to a year to see me. I could easily book out 6 months to a year. That wouldn't be hard. There's an incredible demand for what we do. But I realized that I could see 2,000 people a year and only see them once a year, let's say for an hour each or a couple half hours here and there. Or I could take care of, say, 150 people and be available to them the same day, the next day, within a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. And the truth is, I felt that I wasn't really my patient's doctor if I couldn't see them within a very short period of time, because things happen. You get hit by buses, you fall down and injure yourself on the street, you get a new diagnosis out of the blue when you thought everything was going well. Many, many patients come to the practice. The first round of labs we draw and that we run, we see that their inflammatory markers are elevated. And the conversation is no longer, well, you thought you were healthy and we're just going to sort of dot some I's and cross some T's. It's, you need to get to work on your health because you're in the average or high risk category for heart disease. And that means that we need to optimize your diet. We need to run some additional testing. We need to do some supplements. We need to change your lifestyle. And I track, the other piece of this is, Meredith, is I'm passionate about tracking the outcomes to prove what we do. So we've had only a handful, maybe 2 or 3 people in the practice whose inflammatory markers haven't come down by 50 to 100% within 6 months to a year of starting to work with us. And I've got case study after case study of people's markers who have come down. And the very rare person whose markers go up while they're under care, they tend to come right back down the next quarter when we recheck it. So this is a completely different paradigm. And patients need to realize that what ended up happening was they treated themselves like you would never treat a nice car, which is crazy because a car is actually a lot cheaper than a human being in very real utilitarian terms. Like you go to the hospital and you have an ICU stay, $250,000. Easy. $500,000 if you're there for a long time. That's a McLaren, right? One of the nicest cars in the whole world. And you could buy multiple luxury vehicles for the cost of a single hospitalization. And people who think
that is a very American way of looking at it. A lot of us don't think of it in those terms, but that's a unique problem to this system.
Yeah,
you're still stuck in the hospital for a long time. Yeah, someone's footing that bill.
Exactly. But my point with that is that people think nothing of, well, of course I've got to go get my oil changed every 3 to 4 months, and of course it's going to be $200 because I use full synthetic, and of course I change my windshield wipers because they wear out, and of course I do this and change the cabin air filter. And then people are like, well, that's a $50 copay. That's a lot. Hang on a minute. Let's think through the consequences of you running your car for an extra 5 or 10,000 miles without changing the oil. Now let's think about the consequences of you running your body for an extra 5 to 10 years without going to a doctor who you have a real relationship with. Because my patients, I always wanted to take great care of patients. I always wanted to have this kind of authentic connection with them. When you're not the one paying your doctor, you do not have a relationship with them. You have a relationship with your insurance company, and you have a relationship with the healthcare system that they're employed by, but they fundamentally work for those people. And there's a lot of perverse incentives in that world that people don't know or understand. And there's a lot of political gamesmanship that ends up creating a terrible experience for the patient, which is, again, why doctors are committing suicide in record numbers and leaving the profession in record numbers, the ones who are not killing themselves, and leaving the hospital system in record numbers and spending their spare time and their spare money that they could be spending on vacations and cars and, fun, exciting things in life. They're spending that money getting out of a system that's very sick and dysfunctional. The patients need to realize that if you are not in a therapeutic relationship with a doctor that you trust, you're on your own. Right. And the reason why doctors...
We've kind of been told that's not possible, right? Like it's not...
Yeah, people have gotten used to it not being possible. We've been trained
to see, a pediatrician for 15 minutes once a year and maybe another 15 minutes if people your child has an infection. Yes. And we think that that's normal and that that's fine.
Right.
And what I hear you saying is that our relationships matter to our health. Our relationships in our friendships, our family, our relationship with ourselves. So of course, having a relationship with your care providers would also matter to your health.
100%. And the reason for that, in my opinion, is like, for example, we have a patient in the practice who's not doing well. They're not doing nearly as well as I would like them to do. And because they've been doing as poorly as they have been for as long as they have been, their finances are very tight. But because this patient has been with me for over a year and a half, I care very much about them getting a good outcome. So I sit down with them at regular intervals for free just to try and get them better. And that's the kind of latitude you have when you run your own practice and it's a membership-based model, because your patients, you badly want them to all do well because you unavoidably become attached to them. And you have, if you have genuine empathy, which I hate to say a lot of doctors have no empathy, I think a lot of them, it's been sort of suppressed or robbed from them, or they've run out of it, which is, something called compassion fatigue. It's a real thing. But when you've only got 150 patients, and that doesn't include their family members, I've got 150 patients and or families. So it's more than 150. But when that's the number of people you've got to take great care of, and the vast majority of them, you're doing multiple things, whether it's bioidentical hormones, supplements, talking about light therapy, biohacking, whatever, they keep you busy. But I have the latitude to spend the time I feel I need on the case. And that allows me to get better results, because I would rather get better results for a smaller number of people than just see as many people as possible and have a very commoditized relationship with them.
Yeah. And I think that's sort of like the complete inverse of what we get in the traditional model.
Yes.
And, you talked about the car, and you wouldn't drive your car until it broke. You would get regular maintenance. And it's like, I feel like the medical system is telling us to drive our bodies till they break, and then they have some solutions. But when we're in that gray area where we're like, something's not right.
Right. But that's the perverse.
They don't have any offers.
That's the perverse incentive at work. So yeah. I realized very quickly in practice, when I was not in practice for myself, that the shorter the encounter with the patient, patients want three things when they come to the doctor. They want an idea of what's going on. They want a plan to a solution, and they want a prognosis. They want to know what's likely to happen next, which looks like, you've got this, we're going to do that. It's this life-threatening on a scale of whatever, 0 to you're going to die next week. And that's what they want. And if you have 5 minutes to do that, it looks like this. You have eczema, here's clobetasol, you're going to be fine. That's it. That's the time you have. Because the rest of the time you have to be entering orders in the computer, and you have to be clicking boxes, and you have to be doing paperwork so that you can get paid, or the hospital system can get paid so that they can pay you. And it just degrades the whole relationship. And when you have time, you can get into diet and lifestyle and exercise and all these things. So there are practitioners out there more and more who are creating this kind of practice. I hate to say it, but I see many physicians in my world, functional, natural, integrative, holistic, however you want to call it, still resorting to this commoditization of healthcare, trying to sell patients just too much care, too many supplements, programs and packages and memberships that are inflated in price for no particularly good reason. We see a lot of that going on, and patients who come to us often complain that that's been their experience. And it all comes down to, if you ask me for one piece of advice in vetting a clinician that you work with, it's, do you sense that they have genuine empathy for you? And do they give you a clear roadmap for you to have an ongoing therapeutic relationship with them? Because if they don't have a clear membership model, they're not set up to optimize your outcomes. It's nothing against those who are still stuck in the fee-for-service model. A lot of them are stuck there because they may have been doing it for 40 years. That's a long time to do something and then change direction. But we went membership a year ago or so, and we never looked back. It was an incredibly good move for us, for the patients. They've been very happy. I'm able to take much better care of them. And the reason physicians are increasingly going to do this is that when you take the average person in the public square who hasn't been educated on all this stuff, who's not up on what's really going on with their health, to get them from where they are to optimal, 6 months, a year, hard work, a lot of time. a lot of sometimes negotiating. No, you really do need to take 3 10-minute walks a day. You really do need to eat this way. No, you can't get away with that bad habit that I've told you need to give up. And when you find the 150 to 500 members of your practice who are reasonable and are in it to win it, as I like to say, and who are really willing to show up and own their health and their part in the therapeutic relationship. And this is not new, actually. This is all very old. Hippocrates said the patient must combat the disease along with the physician. And that was over 2,000 years ago. So all of these things are not new problems, but the membership model in our modern world is becoming normal, and it's becoming something that I think is incredibly valuable because there's just so much demand. There's not enough of us. But in part, there's not enough of us because people are still chasing the commoditization of healthcare. They're still shopping based on price rather than the quality of the relationship.
And in that model, it is a long-term model. So as you said, it's like, I might resolve something quickly, but then there's something else that takes longer. And then there's ups and downs. And as we say, we talk about a lot, it's like healing is nonlinear. So to have a linear solution, even if it's a good one, if there's an endpoint on it, then we're going to be without care at some point, because nobody stays perfectly healthy forever all the time, especially in our current environment. Which brings me to a question I wanted to ask. So earlier you mentioned that there were some medications that were super effective at suppressing the symptoms of these terrible autoimmune diseases. So, and because you are a licensed physician, you can still write prescriptions.
Sure.
So how do you see those two things working together, right? Like if I've got a boatload of awful symptoms, like I'm probably pretty excited about that drug. Is there a way to leverage that technology, of that pharmaceutical technology, and at the same time go work through what I need to work through in terms of the environmental causes?
Absolutely. So those drugs are really great for achieving symptom remission. The side effect profile has to be taken into account. That goes without saying, but they can be very helpful. And we never wean those medications until we are convinced that the patient's signs, symptoms, and fundamental underlying disease process is starting to recede or go into remission because of everything else that we're doing. So it's pretty typical, I would say, for people who work with us and really comply with what we recommend, that they see about 50 to 90% improvement in the first 6 months to a year. Sometimes it's 3 to 6 months, but I don't like to overpromise and underdeliver. And as part of that process, what we're trying to do is support the body's underlying healing mechanisms so that they can achieve that. And as we see them clinically improving, we start to consider whether we can taper medications or dose them less frequently. And that's how we handle that. But you can and you should have the best of both worlds, because there's definitely a time and a place for medications. It just has to be really done in a very careful, thoughtful way.
Right. Okay. So in terms of preventative, and what we can wrap up here, what would you say to somebody who is relatively health conscious? They probably eat organic, real food. They probably work out a little bit, but they're still totally at risk for autoimmune, because that's as far as their thinking goes. What would be sort of like the top 3 things that you would tell people? Hey, in this new world that we live in, there are some things you need to think about that maybe you didn't when you were a child, or that we didn't grow up considering. What would they be?
If I were not a physician, the top thing would be joining a membership-based practice so that you have access to someone when you need them, who is going to care for you and value their relationship with you differently than a hospital system, insurance company, or big, clinic. That would be the number one thing. And make sure it's a membership-based clinic. Those are the kinds that really I think are doing the best job and really creating the most sustainable long-term solutions. The second thing would be to, this is just going to be a shameless plug for both you and I, you should tune into everything that we're producing, because we put out the kind of content that gives people practical information. And really, the more I take care of patients and the more I coach patients, which is a big part of our model, the more I'm impressed by the fact that people need to hear the same thing over and over again. And it's not that you've forgotten it. It's not that you don't know it. It's that the human brain is very impressionable. And so what it hears and sees and is told to do over and over and over again, it will remember and it will do, and it will comply with, frankly. So you have to be very careful on that. Sort of the flip side of that is you have to be very careful about who you give your attention to, particularly today with the ability of unscrupulous people to use tools like AI to really create a narrative that doesn't work for people, that is injurious to their health in a fundamental way. I think that, the advent of AI is going to really bring the value of real relationships in the real world back to where it should be and was, 50 years ago when there was no other option, really. So that's number two. And my content's all at stillmanmd.substack.com. If you just go to substack.com and search my last name, it'll come up. Subscribe. There's lots of great articles that come out all the time. And then the third thing would be, you need to take ownership of your health. And what that looks like is carving out time to learn what it means to be healthy. Sadly, we just can't resort to our instincts like our ancestors did. We have too many options, too many choices that we don't understand in the context of our health to just say, well, this looks good, I'm going to eat that, or that tasted good, I'm going to have it again. We have to really learn, what does it take to survive and thrive in 2024? Because it's a very different world. And the winner of the Nobel Prize for the discovery of vitamin C, Albert Szent-Györgyi, has a great quote where he talks about how poorly equipped the human brain is for the modern world. And he was speaking in the context of nuclear conflagration and war as a Hungarian immigrant to the United States after World War II. And things have only gotten more extreme in terms of our technological sophistication and the liabilities that come along with that since he spoke those words in his Nobel, I think it was his Nobel acceptance speech. So those are three quick things.
Three quick things that are a lifetime of work. Yes. And, it is a tough pill to swallow, and that we're all getting there, right? Is that the things that our life is filled with just by default, our laptops, our light bulbs, the food in the grocery store, is harmful.
I know.
And it's like, I think that in itself is a new paradigm. Mm-hmm. We used to be able to maintain our health with fairly simple steps, and health hasn't changed, but the environment that we have been tasked with navigating sure has.
Absolutely.
Yes. Thank you for being here. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I would love for people to subscribe to my newsletter, stillmanmd.substack.com. I love writing the newsletter. I love getting comments and emails back and publishing things that people want to learn about.
Great. Yes. And it is juicy. You do not hold back in that newsletter, I will say.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for having me on, Meredith.
If you wondered if Substack censors, the answer is no.
No.
They don't. Yeah, no, there's some really great stuff in there. Especially on topics that are not well covered in any kind of traditional media. All right, Dr. Stillman, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Woohoo! You made it to the end of another episode. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploratory adventure into new realms. Your energy and support are building a different world, and I am so grateful to be on this journey with you. Take care, and thanks.